Sometimes a single sentence can end an entire lifetime of patience. When my son looked me in the eye and said, "If you don't want the nursing home, get a job," something inside me stopped breathing. It wasn't anger that rose, it was clarity, the kind that makes you finally see the truth you've been refusing to admit. Tell me, if you were me, would you have stayed or would you have walked away too? Let me know where you're watching from. I want to know who's listening to this story. The smell of soup filled the kitchen. Ginger, onion, a hint of patience. It was all I could still offer my son after losing my husband, my health, and most of my savings. But lately, even soup seemed too much for him. From the living room came his raised voice, sharp, exhausted, and bitter. "We can't live like this forever," he barked. His wife agreed, her tone laced with irritation. I stood there quietly, stirring, hoping the warmth of the stove could melt the ice that had grown in my home. It had been 2 years since my husband passed. 2 years of trying to fit into a house that once felt like mine, but no longer belonged to me. Every chair, every curtain, even the family photos had been rearranged by my daughter-in-law's touch. I didn't mind, I told myself. A mother's place changes with time. But lately, I felt like an intruder in the very space I helped build. I often sat by the window, watching my son's car pull into the driveway, pretending that he'd smile when he saw me. He never did. He always walked past as if I were just another piece of furniture he couldn't throw away yet. That evening, my son stormed into the kitchen, still wearing his office clothes. The tie hung loose, the lines on his forehead deeper than before. I wanted to ask if he'd eaten, but he spoke first. "Mom, do you even realize how hard it is for us? You just sit here all day. Electricity, food, medicine, it all costs money." His voice cracked under the weight of frustration, but what hurt me wasn't the words. It was how easy they came out of his mouth. I tried to calm him. "I can sell some of my jewelry," I murmured, still stirring the soup. But he cut me off sharply. "That's not the point. You need to learn to stand on your own. If you don't want the nursing home, get a job." The word struck like a slap across my face. For a heartbeat, the whole house went still. The only sound left was the soft hiss of the boiling soup, as if even it pitied me. The ladle trembled in my hand. Behind him, his wife leaned on the doorway, her arms crossed, lips curved in amusement. "He's just being honest, Mother," she said, as though cruelty had become a form of love. I turned to look at her, the woman my son had chosen, and realized she saw me not as family but as an inconvenience. A piece of the past cluttering her modern life. For a long moment, I just stared at my son. The boy who once ran to me when thunder scared him. The boy who used to sneak into my bed with his blanket, whispering, "Don't let the monsters get me." I almost asked him when he became one of those monsters himself. But I said nothing. My silence was the last dignity I could afford, and maybe deep down I knew words would only give them more reasons to hate me. He left the kitchen without looking back. His wife followed, her perfume lingering in the air long after her footsteps faded. I stood there alone, the smell of burnt onions slowly replacing the warmth of dinner. I switched off the stove, staring into the pot until the soup stopped bubbling. The silence pressed against my ears like punishment, but also, strangely, a warning. Something inside whispered, "This is not your home anymore." Later that night, I placed the dishes on the table, one bowl for each of us, an old habit from when love was simpler. He didn't come down. Only the ticking of the clock kept me company. I sat there, spoon in hand, waiting for something to change. Nothing did. The house was full of noise earlier, yet now it felt emptier than ever. Even the walls seemed tired of listening. When the clock struck midnight, I stood up. My hands moved without thinking. I folded 2 dresses, the blue one my husband loved, and the simple gray one I wore when I first met my daughter-in-law. I took my husband's photo from the bedside, the frame cracked but precious, and tucked it gently into the bag. My wedding ring, which had hung loose on my thinning finger, I slipped into a small pouch. There was no need to carry symbols of promises that no longer existed. I looked around my small room, knowing I was leaving not just a house, but a version of myself that had tolerated too much for too long. On the dining table, I left a short note. "Don't worry, I won't trouble you anymore." My handwriting shook, but the words were steady. Before leaving, I stood by my son's door for a moment. I could hear his soft snoring. He slept soundly, unaware that this would be the last night I'd ever stand outside his room as his mother. I wanted to touch the door, but I stopped myself. Some goodbyes lose their meaning when spoken aloud. The night air was cold, biting against my skin as I stepped outside. The moon hung low, the street empty. Every step I took away from that house felt like peeling off a layer of sorrow. My heart was heavy, yet lighter than it had been in years. I didn't cry. I had spent too many tears on people who mistook them for weakness. I just walked, one step after another, until the house disappeared behind me, swallowed by the dark. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't hurt. It set me free. The city slept, and I slipped into its silence. Streetlights hummed like tired lullabies as I walked, the wind threading cold fingers through my hair. The night smelled of rain and loneliness, a scent I had long forgotten how to hate. I didn't know where my feet were taking me, only that each step carried me further, from the house where I had ceased to be a mother and become a burden. I clutched my small bag to my chest, listening to my own footsteps echo. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passing taxi, its headlights sweeping across me like brief, indifferent glances. For years, I had told myself I was staying with my son to keep the family close. But in truth, I was staying because I was afraid of what would happen if I left. That night, fear became my companion, not my chain. The park appeared at the corner of my eye, the one where my husband used to take our boy when life was still sweet. I wandered in, drawn by ghosts. The swing set creaked in the breeze, its chains rusted but strong, like me. I brushed my fingers over the seat, remembering his tiny hands gripping the ropes, his laughter as he flew toward the sky, shouting, "Higher, Mom, higher!" I smiled bitterly. He had always wanted to fly, and he had, leaving me on the ground where mothers belong. I sat on a park bench, the wood damp from the evening mist. My knees ached, but I stayed. The air felt heavy, pressing against my ribs. Somewhere nearby, a cat meowed softly. It emerged from the shadows, a thin gray thing with clever eyes. It circled me once before rubbing against my leg. "You and I whispered, tearing a piece of bread from my pocket. "We're both strays tonight." The cat purred, took the crumb, and vanished into the dark, leaving me to envy its certainty in the world. When dawn came, the city began to stir. The smell of fried dough and coffee drifted from street vendors, mingling with the metallic scent of morning rain. I wandered through narrow alleys, searching for signs that said, "Help wanted." I entered a grocery shop, asked the owner if he needed help with cleaning or sorting. He looked me over, eyes soft with pity. "You should be home resting, Ajuma." Rest. The word had begun to sound like a curse. I left before my voice could betray me. At a bakery, a young woman smiled apologetically before shaking her head. "No vacancies, Hamione." At a laundry shop, the man didn't even look up. The rejections blurred together until they all sounded like echoes of my son's command, "Get a job." By midday, my legs were trembling. I found a fountain at the edge of the square and sat beside it. The water shimmered, and my reflection wavered in its surface. A face I barely recognized. My hair was unkempt, my skin pale, but my eyes still held a spark, faint but alive. "So this is what he saw," I murmured. An old woman, fragile and fading. But no mirror could show the weight of years carried in silence. The hands that built his world, my hands, were not weak. They were only tired. People passed without glancing. The city moved on, indifferent to another forgotten mother. Yet in that indifference, I found a strange peace. I realized that I was invisible, but invisibility also meant freedom. No one could tell me what to do anymore. When the church bells struck noon, I closed my eyes and leaned back, letting the sun rest on my face. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't go back. The ache in my feet had become a map, each step marking the boundary between who I was and who I might become. Then came the sound of a horn, gentle, patient. I opened my eyes. A sleek black sedan had stopped at the curb, its window rolling down with a soft hum. "Minna? Is that really you?" The voice carried warmth and disbelief. I turned slowly, my heart stuttering in my chest. The man inside wore a familiar smile, a memory from another life. My breath caught. Could it really be him? For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. The city noise dulled, and all I could hear was that voice, the same one that used to call out across the factory gates decades ago. Minna, he said again, leaning forward, his eyes wide with disbelief and something that looked a lot like sorrow. My throat tightened as I stepped closer to the car. Mr. Hahn? I whispered, uncertain if the years had blurred my memory or if fate had decided to mock me. He got out of the car before I could answer my own question. The years had changed him too. Silver hair now framed his once youthful face, but his posture was still proud, his presence steady. He hesitated for a second, taking me in from head to toe. I realized what I must have looked like, hair tangled, clothes wrinkled, eyes swollen from a night of walking and wondering. I tried to hide my bag behind me, ashamed of the life it carried. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. His voice wasn't pitying, it was pained. That difference made me want to cry. I shook my head and forced a smile. "Life happened, I suppose." He gestured to the car. "Come, let's sit somewhere warm." "You look frozen." For a moment, I hesitated. The idea of stepping into that expensive car felt wrong, as if I were trespassing into someone else's life. But when he opened the door and said my name again, I heard not an invitation but concern. So I nodded. Inside the cafe, warmth wrapped around me like a forgotten embrace. Mr. Hahn ordered coffee and bread for both of us. I watched his hands as he poured me a cup, the same hands that once worked beside my husband's, back when all of us were young and believed hard work could solve everything. The steam rose between us like the years we had lost. "I went by your old neighborhood once," he said, his tone cautious, "after your husband passed. I wanted to see how you were doing, but they said you'd moved in with your son. I assumed you were happy." He smiled faintly, almost embarrassed. "Seems I was wrong." I lowered my eyes to the cup. "He's doing his best. Maybe I stayed too long." The truth was heavier than the words. Mr. Hahn didn't respond right away. He just nodded, understanding what I couldn't say. "You've always been strong," he said after a pause. "You deserve peace, Minna. Come stay with me for a while. I have a big house now, too big for just one man. I could use some company, and you could use a place to rest." I stared at him, stunned. "Stay with you? I can't accept that." "Why not?" he asked gently. "You've worked your whole life for others. Let someone work for you, just once." Something in his tone made me look up. There was no pity, only warmth, the kind of kindness that doesn't ask for anything in return. I wanted to refuse again, but my body betrayed me. I was too tired to fight. "Just for a few days," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were a lie. Some part of me already knew. This man would change everything. As we left the cafe, the wind picked up, tugging at my scarf. Mr. Hahn walked beside me, not ahead, not behind. When we reached the car, he opened the door and said, "Welcome home, Minna." For the first time in years, I didn't correct anyone. I simply got in and let the city disappear behind me. The ride to Mr. Hahn's estate felt like drifting between two worlds, the one I had just escaped and another that seemed too distant to belong to me. The city lights slowly thinned until only rolling fields and the sound of the wind remained. I pressed my fingers against the window, watching as dawn painted the sky in pale gold. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was being carried somewhere new. When the car stopped, I stepped out and froze. Before me stood a house so large it almost seemed unreal. The gates opened soundlessly, revealing a long driveway lined with cherry trees and a garden that seemed to breathe with color even in the cool morning air. The estate was elegant but not cold. It had the kind of beauty that carried memory, not just wealth. "It's too much," I whispered. Mr. Hahn only smiled. "Then it's exactly what you need." Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of cedar and jasmine. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, softening the marble floors. I half expected someone to stop me, to tell me I didn't belong here. But instead, a woman in a crisp uniform greeted us with a bow. "Good morning, Madam Min," she said kindly. The title startled me. It felt borrowed, but it also felt good. Mr. Hahn didn't correct her, and I didn't either. He gave me a brief tour of the house, the reading room filled with old books, the sunlit kitchen where copper pots gleamed, and a garden that stretched behind the house, bursting with roses and herbs. "This was my wife's passion," he said quietly, pointing to the garden. After she passed, it went wild. Maybe you can help me bring it back to life." His voice softened at the edges, and I saw in him the same loneliness I carried in myself. My room overlooked the garden. The bed was soft, the curtains white and gentle. I ran my hand across the dresser, feeling the smooth wood beneath my fingers. Everything looked untouched, waiting for me to give it purpose. For the first time since leaving my son's house, I sat down without fear of being told to move. Days began to settle into rhythm. I woke before sunrise, as I always had, and wandered the garden barefoot, feeling the dew beneath my feet. The staff were kind but distant at first, unsure of who I was. When they learned I had once managed a household for my family, their hesitation melted. Soon they began asking me small things: how to season soup properly, how to clean without wasting water, how to soothe a child's fever. They called me Madam Min too, and I found myself smiling when they did. Mr. Han visited the kitchen often, teasing the cook and stealing bites of breakfast. "You see, the house feels alive again," he'd tell me. "I should have brought you here sooner." His laughter filled the hallways, and sometimes, when he caught me watching him, his eyes softened in a way that made my heart tremble, like remembering a song you'd forgotten how to hum. At night, I wrote in my old notebook, the one I used to keep recipes in. Only now, I wrote about the feeling of breathing again. I wrote about warmth, and about learning how to live without asking for permission. I wrote about kindness that expected nothing in return. I began to see the lines on my face not as proof of age, but as the map of a woman who had survived. One evening, as I trimmed the roses, Mr. Han came to stand beside me. "You've brought light back to this house," he said. I laughed softly. "No, this house gave me back my name." He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze gentle but unreadable. Maybe both can be true. The garden rustled in agreement. Sometimes I caught myself thinking of my son, not with anger, but with a sadness that no longer hurt as much. I wondered if he'd eaten, if the house felt too quiet without me. But when I closed my eyes, I didn't see his shouting face anymore. I saw the road I'd walked, the sunrise over the hills, and the man who had offered me a home when the world had forgotten I needed one. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow. I woke each day knowing there was work to do, but it was the kind of work that healed instead of drained. The laughter in the kitchen, the scent of bread, the chatter of the maids, it all felt like music written just for me. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. The first few weeks at the Han estate passed like a quiet dream. I still woke at dawn, half expecting to hear my son's irritated voice calling from the next room. But the only sound that greeted me here was the cooing of doves and the whisper of wind through the cherry trees. I would sit by the window with a cup of tea and watch the sunlight crawl across the garden. Each morning, I felt a little less like a guest and a little more like a woman rediscovering her place in the world. Mr. Han often joined me for breakfast. He was never loud or demanding like my son. Instead, he spoke softly, as though conversation were a delicate thing that needed care. He told me stories about the years after my husband died, how lonely the house had been since his wife's passing, how he had thrown himself into work to escape the silence. "You can build walls out of grief," he once said, "but they only end up keeping the light out." His words lingered in my mind long after he left the table. During the day, I busied myself with the house. The garden became my favorite place, and every morning I tied my scarf and tended to it. The roses bloomed under my hands as though they too were waiting for someone to believe in them again. I taught the younger maids how to make natural fertilizer, how to prune gently instead of harshly, and how to whisper to plants so they'd grow stronger. They laughed at first, but when the buds opened faster, they began to believe me. In the afternoons, I cooked, not because anyone asked me to, but because it made me happy. I filled the kitchen with scents of soy and ginger, just as I used to when my husband was alive. The staff often gathered around, watching, eager to learn my recipes. Sometimes, even Mr. Han would roll up his sleeves and pretend to help, though he mostly ended up stealing pieces of marinated meat before they hit the pan. I scolded him half-heartedly, and he'd grin like a boy. The house echoed with laughter that had been missing for years. But even in happiness, there were quiet nights when I sat alone in my room and thought of my son. I wondered what he was doing, if his anger had cooled or if he still blamed me for leaving. Sometimes I missed him so much that I pressed my hand to my chest just to remind myself I was still here. I didn't hate him, not even after everything. Mothers don't know how to hate their children properly. They only learn how to hurt quietly. One rainy evening, as I was closing the windows, Mr. Hahn came to check on me. He stood at the doorway with 2 cups of tea. "The rain's been kind to the roses," he said. "They look stronger." I smiled faintly. Maybe they finally understand that storms don't last forever. He nodded, and for a moment, our eyes met in silence. There was comfort there, an understanding between 2 people who had both been left behind by life, yet found new warmth in the ruins. As days turned to months, my steps grew lighter. My back straightened again. The housemaids began to come to me with their small troubles: love quarrels, family disputes, dreams of leaving and becoming something more. They said my advice helped them, but what they didn't realize was that their faith in me was what healed me. For years I had been invisible, but here I mattered. Every evening when the lamps were lit and the hallways glowed in amber light, I walked through the house to make sure everything was in its place. It reminded me of who I used to be, a woman who made a home not out of walls but out of care. Mr. Hahn often watched me from the doorway, his expression soft. "You know," he said one night, "I think you've saved this house." I looked at him startled. "No, Mr. Hahn, this house saved me." And maybe both were true, because somewhere between tending the roses and baking the morning bread, I found the part of myself I thought I'd lost forever, the part that still believed in love, in kindness, in beginnings that come after endings. While peace bloomed around me at the Hahn estate, another story was unraveling miles away. One I did not yet know. My son's world, the one built on pride and impatience, was beginning to crack. It started with small misfortunes, as most downfalls do. The company he worked for faced trouble, and his position, once secure, was suddenly uncertain. He began coming home late, drunk, or sometimes not at all. His wife grew restless, her tongue sharper with each passing day. Without me there to clean, cook, or calm the storm, their home became a battlefield of blame. Neighbors whispered about the fights that spilled into the night, the shouting, the sound of broken glass. The same people who once pitied me now pitied him. "He drove his own mother away," they said, shaking their heads, "and now look at him." But gossip doesn't heal. It only echoes the truth people don't want to face. One day, when the maid from my old neighborhood came to deliver flowers to the estate, she recognized me. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Madam Min? Everyone thought you were gone. They said your son couldn't find you." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I tried to hide the tremor in my voice. How is he?" I asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "He's not doing well. He lost his job. His wife left him. He's alone now." That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped at the window like an unwelcome memory. I stared at the ceiling, wondering if he had eaten, if he still blamed me, or if he had finally realized what he had done. I didn't wish suffering upon him, not truly, but a part of me hoped he finally understood what it felt like to be unwanted. Meanwhile, life at the estate continued its quiet rhythm. Mr. Hahn noticed my silence over breakfast. "You've been far away these past few days, Versailles," he said. I forced a smile, but just thinking about the past. It's a stubborn thing. It doesn't know when to leave. He nodded knowingly, then said, "Sometimes the past follows us until we forgive it. And sometimes forgiveness is the only way we can move forward." His words lingered long after he left the table. As the days grew colder, I found myself standing by the gate more often, looking out at the winding road that led back to the city. The air carried the faint scent of rain and exhaust, and I wondered if he might ever walk that road to find me. I imagined him standing at the door, ashamed, thinner, older. I imagined what I would say if that day came. But each time my words faltered before they formed. The first snow arrived late that year. The estate glittered beneath it, the garden sleeping under a blanket of white. I watched the staff laughing as they built snowmen, their joy infectious. Even Mr. Hahn joined in, his laughter echoing across the courtyard. He caught me watching from the veranda and beckoned me to join, but I stayed where I was, smiling faintly. "You look like someone who belongs here," he said later, brushing snow from his coat. "Even the house agrees." His kindness was steady, gentle, but my heart still carried a weight I couldn't set down. Weeks later, as winter began to fade, a letter arrived. The envelope was thin, the handwriting familiar but shaky. My name, Mother, written on it in trembling ink. My hands trembled too as I tore it open. Inside were just a few words. I was wrong. I miss you. Please forgive me. Tears blurred the paper. I traced the words with my fingertips, feeling the ache of every syllable. There was no return address, no number, no clue of where he was, just his confession floating between us like a bridge that might still hold. That night, Mr. Hahn found me sitting in the garden with the letter clutched in my lap. From him? He asked quietly. I nodded. He didn't pry. Instead, he set a shawl over my shoulders and said, Some roads lead back home, Minna, but sometimes home is where you choose to stay. I looked at the glowing windows of the house, the warmth, the laughter, the life I had built anew. Then I looked up at the night sky and whispered, If he ever finds his way here, I'll be ready. And for the first time, I meant it. I didn't long for revenge or even apology. I only wished him peace, the kind I had finally learned to give myself. Spring returned like an old friend, soft, cautious, and full of memories. The garden woke under my hands once more, and the air smelled of new beginnings. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Perhaps it was instinct, the mother's sixth sense that never truly sleeps, no matter how much time or distance stretches between hearts. It was an ordinary afternoon when the sound of a car engine broke the quiet peace of the estate. I was in the garden trimming rose stems when the chauffeur came hurrying down the path. Madam Min, he called gently. There's someone at the gate asking for you. I wiped my hands on my apron, expecting perhaps a delivery or one of the neighbors, but the way his voice trembled made my stomach twist. Who is it? I asked. He hesitated. He said, He's your son. My pruning shears slipped from my fingers and landed softly in the dirt. The world tilted. My heart, steady for months, began to pound like it was remembering how to be afraid. My son? I whispered. Here? The chauffeur nodded, his face full of sympathy. I walked toward the main gate slowly, every step dragging memories behind it. The wind stirred the branches, carrying faint echoes of a voice I used to know. When I reached the gate, I saw him. My son stood there, thinner, paler, eyes sunken as though he hadn't slept in weeks. The confident young man who once raised his voice at me had disappeared. What stood before me now was someone smaller, humbled by life. He saw me and froze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, as though his knees could no longer bear the weight of his pride, he dropped to the ground. Mom, he said, voice breaking, please forgive me. I wanted to rush to him, to cradle his head and tell him it was all right, but I couldn't, not yet. My heart was torn between the instinct to comfort and the pain that still lingered like a scar. Get up, I said quietly, though my voice trembled. He didn't. He just kept crying, the sound raw and real. You were right, he said between sobs. I was proud, selfish. When you left, I thought you'd come back after a few days. I told myself you couldn't survive without me. But when I came home to an empty house, I realized I was the one who couldn't survive without you. His words hit me harder than the coldest night I had ever known. I knelt beside him. My fingers hovered near his shoulder but didn't touch. You told me to get a job, I said softly, echoing the words that had once shattered me. And I did. He looked up, his tear-filled eyes flicking toward the mansion behind me. Is this where you live now? I nodded. Do they treat you well, he asked? Better than I treated you? Better than you ever thought I deserved, I replied, not in anger, but in quiet truth. He bowed his head again. I'm sorry, Mom. I've lost everything. My wife, my job. I thought I was punishing you when I told you to leave, but I was really punishing myself. Silence stretched between us, heavy but necessary. The only sound was the rustle of the trees and the soft hum of the car engine idling nearby. Finally, I took a deep breath. You lost what was built on pride, I said gently, but you still have what's built on love. Don't waste that again. He looked at me with a flicker of hope. Does that mean you forgive me? I smiled faintly. Forgiveness isn't a gift, my son. It's a process. I've started mine. You must start yours too. At that moment, the limousine appeared from the far end of the driveway. Mr. Hahn stepped out, glancing between us with quiet understanding. Madam, he said softly, We should go. We'll be late for the meeting. His tone was respectful, but the title, Madam, made my son's eyes widen. Madam? He repeated in disbelief. Mr. Han nodded politely. Your mother is a very important person here. I could see the realization dawn in his face. He finally understood how much I had grown beyond the woman he once belittled. I turned to my son one last time. Take care of yourself, I said. Eat properly, work honestly, and when you look at other people, remember this moment, how it feels to be on your knees and still loved. He began to cry again, this time quietly, as though the tears themselves were cleansing. I reached out, brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and whispered, You'll be all right. Then I stood, my knees steady, my heart calm. The chauffeur opened the door of the limousine, and I stepped inside. As the car rolled forward, I looked through the window at my son growing smaller in the distance, his figure bent, but his soul beginning to rise. The road curved ahead, sunlight breaking through the trees. Mr. Han glanced at me. Are you all right? He asked. I smiled faintly. For the first time, I think I am. As the estate faded behind us, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself. He wanted me to get a job. Instead, I found my worth. The road shimmered under the afternoon sun, the same one that had witnessed our every goodbye. As the limousine moved away from the estate's gate, I looked back through the tinted glass, watching my son shrink into the distance. His figure blurred, trembling between shadow and light. My chest ached, not from anger anymore, but from a tenderness that refused to die, no matter how many times it had been bruised. Mr. Han said nothing as we drove. The air inside the car was soft, heavy with words unspoken. Outside, the countryside rolled by, fields of green, hills that rose and fell like the quiet rhythm of forgiveness. I rested my hand on my lap, feeling the faint tremor in my fingers, the echo of all the years I'd held everything inside. My heart was both full and empty, the way the sea looks after a storm. When we reached the city, the streets were alive with noise, children chasing each other, vendors calling out their prices, couples holding hands as if the world had never known sorrow. It struck me then, life continues, always. Whether we are broken or whole, the days do not stop. They ask us to rise again no matter how tired we are. I smiled faintly, realizing that I had finally learned how to live without apology. The limousine slowed at a red light. Across the street, a young mother was holding her son's hand as they crossed. The boy looked up at her, asking for something with those wide, demanding eyes only children have. She laughed, bending down to listen. The moment pierced me, beautiful and cruel. Once that had been me, young, hopeful, believing love could fix everything. I turned my gaze away before the light changed. Mr. Han's voice broke the silence. Do you regret it? He asked quietly. His question was simple, but I knew what he meant. Did I regret leaving my son that night? Did I regret walking away instead of staying to be humiliated a little longer? I thought of my old kitchen, the smell of burnt soup, the clatter of plates, the sound of his angry voice cutting through the air. I thought of the nights I cried silently so no one would hear. And then I thought of the garden I now tended, of laughter returning to my throat, of peace resting lightly on my shoulders. I turned to Mr. Han and said, No. Some wounds heal only when you stop touching them. I left to heal. I stayed away to survive. He nodded, his eyes warm with understanding. You're stronger than you think. Maybe, I said softly, but I never wanted to be strong. I just wanted to be loved. The city melted into the horizon as we drove toward the banquet hall. People in elegant clothes passed by, their faces bright with ambition and stories I'd never know. Mr. Han helped me out of the car, offering his arm. You'll be the star of the evening, he teased gently. I shook my head. No, I'm just someone who finally learned her worth. Inside, the hall glittered with chandeliers, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. But I wasn't thinking about any of it. Somewhere beyond the walls of wealth and music, my son was standing on a quiet road, watching a limousine disappear into the sunlight. I hoped he understood now, not just my pain, but my strength. I prayed he would find his own path, not through guilt, but through growth. As I raised a glass to the evening's toast, I thought of the letter he had once written. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I had never replied. Maybe I didn't need to. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come in words, but in silence, in the peace that settles over your heart when you finally stop looking back. When the night ended and we returned home, I stood in the garden one last time before bed. The moon hung low, silvering the petals of the roses I had nursed back to life. They swayed gently, alive again despite the storms they had endured. I knelt down, touched one soft bloom, and whispered, "We both made it, didn't we?" The wind carried my words into the dark, toward the city, toward the boy who once broke my heart, and the man who was still learning to mend his own. I knew then that I had truly said goodbye, not in bitterness, but in love. And for the first time, the word goodbye didn't feel like an ending. It felt like freedom. Section 9, The Reflection. That night, the moon hung low above the Hahn estate, its silver light washing over the garden I had tended with my own hands. I sat by the window, unable to sleep, the silence humming softly around me. The echoes of laughter from the banquet still lingered faintly in my ears, the laughter of people who had never known the taste of humiliation, of people who believed peace was born from wealth. I had learned otherwise. Peace was born from pain, shaped by survival, and carried in the quiet heart of those who refused to break. I looked out at the endless stretch of land below, the fields glowing under the moonlight, and beyond them the faraway glitter of the city. Somewhere out there, my son was sleeping, perhaps still lost in regret, perhaps still searching for the woman he had driven away. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer for him, not that he would find me, but that he would find himself. There was a time when I thought being a mother meant giving until there was nothing left to give. That love was proven through sacrifice, obedience, and silence. But as I traced the memory of my own life, I realized that I had mistaken endurance for devotion. Love isn't about staying in the fire. It's about knowing when to step out before it consumes you entirely. Leaving my son hadn't been a betrayal. It had been the only act of love I had left. The house was quiet now, the kind of quiet that once used to frighten me. But tonight, it felt like peace. I rose from my chair and wandered through the halls. The marble floors, once intimidating, now felt familiar under my bare feet. The scent of jasmine floated through the air from the garden. Every room told a piece of my story. The laughter in the kitchen, the smell of bread in the oven, the library where Mr. Hahn and I would read, side by side, saying little but understanding much. This place had not replaced my family, it had restored me to myself. When I stepped outside, dawn was beginning to bloom, pale light spilling across the earth like spilled milk. The garden shimmered with dew, the roses bowing under their own beauty. I walked among them, touching each petal with reverence. "You were dying when I came," I whispered to them, "and so was I. Look at us now." A soft crunch of gravel behind me made me turn. Mr. Hahn approached quietly, holding 2 steaming cups of tea. "You're up early again," he said. I smiled, taking the cup he offered. "I never sleep much these days. My dreams are too loud." He chuckled softly. "Then maybe you're meant to live in the waking world now, not the one that keeps you waiting." We stood together, watching the sun rise above the horizon, streaks of gold cutting through the mist. "You've changed," he said gently. "When I first saw you, you were carrying grief like a weight. Now it looks more like wings." I laughed softly. "Maybe that's what peace does. It doesn't take away the pain. It teaches you how to fly with it." Mr. Hahn nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Then promise me something, Minna. Don't spend the rest of your life apologizing for being happy." His words settled deep in my chest, I promised. Later that morning, after breakfast, I went to the study and found my old recipe book. Its pages were worn and stained with soy sauce, the corners curled with age. Between the pages, I slipped a letter I had written during the night, a letter addressed to my son, but meant for me as much as for him. "My dear boy, you once told me to get a job, as if my worth depended on what I could earn. But you were right in one way. You pushed me toward the world again. You forced me to see that I was still alive. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I do. You may never understand what that means, but one day, when you have lost something that cannot be replaced, you will. Until then, I hope you live, not in shame, but in learning. Love always, Mother." When I finished, I closed the book and returned it to the shelf. The act felt like closing a door, not in bitterness, but in completion. I didn't need to send the letter. Some messages are better left to the wind. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I joined the staff for tea in the courtyard. They laughed easily, unguarded, their joy pure and unpracticed. For the first time, I joined in, not out of politeness, but out of belonging. Their laughter didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like home. When night returned, I stood once more by the window. The moon was high now, pale and patient. I thought of my husband's laughter, my son's first steps, the long road that had brought me here. I realized that every loss, every cruelty, every heartbreak had been a lesson in strength. I had spent years waiting for someone to save me, only to discover that salvation had been in my own hands all along. I whispered a final goodbye, not to my son, not to my past, but to the woman who had once believed that love must hurt to be real. She had served her purpose. She had carried me this far, but now it was my turn to live. And as the wind moved through the garden below, stirring the roses into a soft dance, I smiled. Not the brittle smile of survival, but the deep, knowing smile of a woman who had finally come home to herself and found that home was never a place. It was peace. The days passed in gentle rhythm, like pages turning themselves. The mornings at the Hahn estate began with sunlight dripping through lace curtains and the sound of birds gossiping outside my window. The house was no longer a stranger to me. It breathed, and I breathed with it. I rose before dawn each day, as I always had, and walked through the garden barefoot, feeling the earth cool beneath my steps. I was not searching for anything anymore, only existing quietly and completely. But peace has a strange way of testing those who find it. It was on one such morning that I first met him, the new gardener's assistant. He was young, no older than my son had been when he first left home, tall but thin, with the kind of restless energy that made the air around him hum. His name was June. Mr. Hahn had hired him from the nearby village after hearing his family had fallen on hard times. "He's rough," the head gardener had warned me, "but he learns fast." The first time I saw him, he was standing in the garden with his hands shoved into his pockets, staring at the ground as though it owed him an apology. Something in his posture struck me. It was too familiar. That slouch of defiance, that tightness in the jaw, I recognized it instantly. Pride. The kind my son used to wear like armor. At first I kept my distance. I gave him polite instructions and nothing more. But June always found a way to test me. He forgot his tools, watered the same patch of soil twice, snapped the heads off delicate roses because he wasn't paying attention. When I corrected him, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. I know, I'm not a child. I tried to be patient, but each encounter left my heart aching with memories. One afternoon, when he dropped a tray of seedlings and cursed under his breath, I felt my composure slip. "Careful," I snapped. "Those are living things, not toys for your temper." He glared at me then, really glared. And for a heartbeat, I saw my son's eyes looking back at me. The same fire, the same wounded pride. I turned away before he could see the tears rising. The next morning, he didn't show up. By noon, I found him sitting behind the greenhouse, a cigarette between his fingers, his head bowed. "You shouldn't smoke here," I said softly, stepping closer. He startled, then scoffed. "What do you care?" I wanted to say I don't, but that would have been a lie. His voice carried the same brittle arrogance my son's once did, the kind that hides fear beneath a thin layer of anger. Instead, I said, "You remind me of someone I used to love very much." He frowned, confused. "Your son?" he guessed. I nodded. His face softened a little. "He must have been lucky," he said quietly. "Mine left when I was 10. The words sank between us like stones. Suddenly, I understood. The defiance, the temper, it wasn't rebellion. It was armor against abandonment. My throat tightened as I looked at him. "Then I suppose you and I both lost someone," I whispered. After that day, something shifted. June started showing up early, following my instructions without complaint. When I taught him how to prune the roses properly, he listened, really listened. "You have to cut the dead parts so new life can grow," I told him. "It's cruel, but it's the only way." He nodded slowly, as if the lesson were meant for more than the garden. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. Once, when I stumbled on a loose stone, he rushed to steady me, his hand awkward and unsure. "Careful," he muttered, his face red. "You could get hurt." The words, clumsy but sincere, filled a space inside me I hadn't realized was still empty. A few evenings later, while closing the greenhouse, I found him sitting on the steps staring at the sky. "You ever forgive him?" he asked suddenly. It took me a moment to understand. Your son, he clarified. Did you ever forgive him? I looked out at the horizon where the sun was bleeding into the clouds. Forgiveness isn't something you decide once, I said softly. It's something you practice every day until it stops hurting. He nodded, his eyes glistening in the fading light. Maybe I'll learn that too. In that moment, I felt something inside me settle. I realized that motherhood doesn't disappear. It only changes shape. My son had been born of my body, but this boy, this lost soul trying to grow, had been born of my compassion. And perhaps that, too, was a kind of motherhood. As I walked back to the house that evening, I looked over my shoulder at June. He was still sitting there, watching the sunset. The wind brushed his hair, and for a brief, impossible second, I saw my son's silhouette in his place. My throat tightened, but this time, I didn't cry. I simply whispered into the quiet air, "Be better than him." The garden answered with the rustle of leaves, a sound like applause. And as I stepped inside, I realized that the ache in my heart had changed. It no longer felt like loss. It felt like love, reborn in a new form, softer and wiser than before. It had been nearly 6 months since June came to the estate. By then, the rhythm of our days had become something steady, almost sacred. He worked hard now, his rough edges softened by patience and purpose. He spoke less, listened more, and carried a quiet respect in his movements. The garden loved him too. Flowers bloomed more vividly under his care, and I often caught him humming while watering the lilies. Peace, once a stranger in my life, had begun to feel like an old friend. But peace, as I had learned, has its way of testing hearts, and mine was not yet done being tested. One morning, as I was sorting through my old notebooks in the study, I came across a box I hadn't opened in years. It was the one I had brought with me when I left my son's house, the box that held the remnants of a life I thought I had buried. I brushed off the thin layer of dust and opened it slowly. Inside were a few photos, a faded scarf, and letters I'd written but never sent. And at the bottom of the stack was one envelope I didn't recognize. My name was written on it, in a shaky hand, my son's handwriting. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My fingers trembled as I lifted it out. The paper was worn as if it had been held too many times before being sent. I didn't know when it had arrived or how it had ended up among my things. Perhaps Mr. Hahn or one of the staff had placed it there quietly, not wanting to disturb me. But there it was, waiting. I sat by the window, the morning light pouring over the envelope like a blessing and a curse. Slowly, I tore it open. "Mother, I don't know where you are. I've gone back to the old neighborhood, asked everyone, but no one knows. They say you're living somewhere safe, with kind people. I hope that's true. I don't deserve to know more. I wanted to say this sooner, but I was a coward. I thought admitting I was wrong would make me small. Now I know that what makes a man small is pride, the kind I learned too well. I remember the night you left. I was angry. But when I found your note, I realized you had taken more than your things. You had taken the warmth from our home. Without you, the walls turned cold. The air turned heavy. I wanted to apologize, but the days became months, and I didn't know how to start. I don't want money or forgiveness or even for you to come back. I just want you to know that I finally understand. I hurt the only person who ever loved me without conditions. If there is a way to begin again, even from far away, I'll wait for it. Your son, Jinho." I read the letter 3 times, each word cutting and healing at once. My tears fell into the ink, blurring his name until it looked like a watercolor of regret. For years I had imagined this moment, his apology, his voice breaking through the distance, but I never thought it would come this gently. When I finally looked up, June was standing by the door watching me. He must have come in quietly. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone careful. I nodded, clutching the letter to my chest. "Yes," I whispered. "Just an old wound, remembering it's still healing." He hesitated before stepping closer. "Was it from your son?" I nodded again. "Do you think you'll write him back?" I looked down at the letter, the smudged ink still glistening with tears. "No," I said softly. "Some words don't need an answer. They just need to be heard." June stood beside me for a while, neither of us speaking. Then quietly he said, "Maybe he'll come find you someday." I smiled faintly. If he does, I hope he finds the woman I've become, not the one he left behind. Later that night, I placed the letter in my old recipe book, beside the one I had written to him months before. 2 letters side by side, his apology, my forgiveness, both finally resting in peace. And as I closed the book, I whispered into the stillness, "We've said enough, my son. The rest, I'll leave to time." That night, I dreamed of him, not as the man who hurt me, but as the boy who used to run barefoot through the yard, laughing, calling out for me to watch him. And for the first time in many years, I didn't wake up crying. A year passed quietly after the letter. The seasons rolled over the Hahn estate like silk, spring's soft blush giving way to the heat of summer, then the whisper of autumn's gold. Life found its rhythm again, not through routine, but through peace. The garden thrived, June had become the estate's pride, and laughter had grown as natural as the sunrise. Yet beneath the calm surface, a question lingered, one I tried not to ask. Would I ever see my son again? Fate has a strange way of answering questions when you least expect them. It was late one afternoon in early winter when the sky had begun to turn the color of ashes. I was arranging fresh roses in the hall when the butler came rushing in, his face pale with surprise. "Madam Min," he said breathlessly. "There's a man at the gate. He's asking for you." I frowned. "Who?" He hesitated, then spoke softly. "He said his name is Jin Ho." The vase nearly slipped from my hands. My breath caught as the air thickened. For a moment, the whole world seemed to still. My heart, that had learned the rhythm of calm, stumbled into chaos. "Where is he?" I whispered. "At the gate, madam. Shall I send him away?" Send him away? The words echoed sharp and cold. How many times had I wished to see him again, and now, faced with the chance, I felt frozen. "No," I said finally, my voice shaking. "Bring him in." I waited in the drawing room, my fingers twisting the edge of my shawl. When the door opened, I barely recognized the man who stepped inside. His hair was streaked with gray, his face drawn, his eyes older than his years. But it was him, my Jin-ho, the boy I had raised, the man I had lost. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands trembling at his sides. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he bowed his head and whispered, "Mother." The sound of that word, one I had not heard in years, broke something inside me. I took a step forward, then another. My heart was screaming to reach him, to hold him, to erase the years between us, but my feet hesitated. He had once told me to get a job, to earn my place in his world. Now, it seemed, he had come to earn his in mine. "I didn't think you'd see me," he said, his voice unsteady. I almost turned back twice. I looked at him, at the man he had become, and said softly, "You came, didn't you? That's what matters." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I lost everything, Mother. I thought success would make me powerful, but it only made me empty. When I saw your letter in my dreams, I knew I had to find you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box. "This was yours," he said, placing it on the table. Inside lay my old wedding ring, the one I had left behind that night I walked away. I kept it all this time. I couldn't throw it away. My throat tightened. "Why now?" I asked. "Why bring it back after all these years?" "Because I thought giving it back might give you closure," he said. "But now I see it was never about the ring. It was about finding the courage to face you, to face what I became." We stood there, two lives separated by pride and time, finally breathing the same air. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, of things understood, of pain acknowledged. "I forgive you," I said at last. The words came gently like leaves falling in autumn. "I forgave you long before you came." He covered his face with his hands and began to cry. The sound was raw, broken, the kind that comes from the soul. I stepped forward and laid a trembling hand on his shoulder. For the first time in decades, I called him by name. "Jin-ho." He looked up, tears tracing the lines of his face. "Can I stay a while?" he asked. I smiled through my tears. "Stay as long as you need." Later that evening, we walked through the garden together. The roses were sleeping under the frost, but their scent lingered. He looked around, his voice quiet. "This place suits you, Mother. You belong here." I nodded. "Yes, I do now, but there's room for you too, if you want to learn what peace feels like." He smiled faintly, and for the first time since he was a child, he took my arm. The gesture was simple, yet it mended something that words never could. We walked beneath the twilight sky, mother and son, both finally learning what forgiveness truly means, not forgetting the past, but choosing not to let it define the rest of our days. The following months unfolded like a slow, beautiful dream. My son stayed at the estate through the winter, helping June with the garden, eating meals with the staff, and sitting beside me in the evenings by the fireplace. We didn't speak much about the past. There was no need. Our silence had become gentle, full of understanding instead of resentment. Sometimes he would tell me about small things, how he had learned to cook, how he had started taking walks alone to clear his thoughts. Each word felt like a brick being laid between us, rebuilding something we had both destroyed. Mr. Han treated him kindly, though I could sense the quiet protectiveness in his eyes whenever Jinho was near. I thanked him one evening for his patience. "He's a man trying to find his way back to himself," Mr. Han said. "Sometimes all a man needs is to know forgiveness is possible." His words echoed in my mind for days. Spring came early that year. The garden was wild with color, roses climbing over the stone walls like flames. The estate hummed with life, but I had begun to feel a strange heaviness in my body, a quiet fatigue that refused to leave. I brushed it aside at first, blaming the work, the long hours, the early mornings. Yet every day, the ache grew stronger, as if my body was whispering something my heart already knew. One afternoon, as I rested in the garden, Jinho came to me carrying a tray of tea. His hand shook slightly, and I could see worry etched into his face. "You should be inside, Mother," he said softly. "You've been pale all week." I smiled and reached for the cup. "Don't fuss over me. I've lived long enough to know when a little rest will do." But when I tried to lift the cup, my hand trembled, spilling a few drops onto the table. He caught my wrist gently. "Mother," he whispered, and the fear in his voice made my chest ache more than the weakness in my limbs. "Please, see a doctor." I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man who once shouted at me, but the boy who used to worry over my scraped fingers. "Soon," I said quietly. "But for now, sit with me. The roses are blooming." And so we sat together in silence, watching the petals dance in the soft wind. The sun warmed our faces, and for a brief, perfect moment, it felt like the world had forgiven us both. That night, I could not sleep. I walked through the halls, touching the walls, the door frames, the windows, memorizing the shape of my piece. When I reached the kitchen, I found June still awake, polishing tools. He looked up, startled. "Madam, it's late," I smiled. "I just wanted to see the house once more before morning." He frowned, confused, but didn't ask why. I went to my room and sat by the window until dawn. The first light crept over the horizon, painting the sky gold. I felt no fear, only gratitude. My son was safe. The house was full of warmth. My heart, once broken, had found its rhythm again. When Jinho came to check on me that morning, he found me still sitting by the window, my hands folded in my lap, the faintest smile on my lips. The tea on my bedside table had gone cold. The roses outside were just beginning to open, their scent drifting through the curtains. He fell to his knees, calling my name again and again, but the house remained silent. I had already gone where pain could not reach me. Later that day, Mr. Han and the staff filled the garden with white lilies. June wept openly, and Jinho stood beside him, the wind tugging at his sleeves. He held my old wedding ring in his hand and whispered, "She taught me how to live. Even in her leaving, she still teaches me how to love." They buried me beneath the largest rose bush, the one I had nursed back to life. The earth was soft, the flowers bright, and though my eyes could no longer see them, I knew they would bloom every spring, a reminder that even broken things can grow again when tended with love. Spring returned again to the Han estate, brighter and more alive than ever before. The roses grew wild with color, curling their petals toward the sun as if to greet the woman who had once coaxed them back to life. The air was sweet, the soil rich, and the house seemed to hum with quiet remembrance. My absence lingered, not as sorrow but as warmth, woven into every petal, every whispered breeze. June had taken my place in the garden. His hands, once clumsy and uncertain, now moved with care and confidence. He spoke softly to the plants as he worked, repeating lessons I had once given him. "Trim what's dying, so life can return," he would murmur, and every time he said it, a faint smile crossed his face as though he could still hear my voice beside him. Sometimes he caught himself looking toward the veranda, expecting to see me there, hands folded, nodding in approval. Mr. Han watched over the estate from the library window. Age had touched him gently, silvering his hair, softening his gaze. The house had become quieter without my laughter echoing through its halls, but not empty. He had kept my things as they were: my teacup, my shawl, my small notebook filled with recipes and thoughts. Some nights, he sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea, staring at the spot where I used to sit. The staff often found him smiling to himself. She'd tell me to stop brooding, he would say. She never liked a quiet room. And Jinho, my son, visited often. Each visit, he brought something new for the garden. A sapling, a packet of seeds, a handful of lilies from his own home. He no longer wore expensive suits or spoke with pride. Instead, he came in simple clothes, dirt under his nails, humility in his smile. The first time he planted a rose bush beside my grave, June knelt beside him to help. They worked in silence, the older man and the younger, the air between them filled with something unspoken but sacred. After they finished, Jinho sat back and brushed the soil from his palms. "She'd scold me for how uneven that row is," he said softly. June laughed. "She'd scold me too, but she'd fix it when we weren't looking." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that carries both grief and gratitude. Each spring, the staff gathered in the garden to celebrate the anniversary of my passing. It wasn't a sad occasion. They would cook, sing, and tell stories about me, the stubborn way I argued over tea recipes, the way I always insisted on feeding the birds before myself. The laughter that drifted through the estate sounded like the echo of a promise kept. Even the roses seemed to bloom brighter those days, as if reaching for the joy that had once filled the air. Jinho always came, early on those mornings, standing by the rose bush under which I rested. He would kneel, brush the petals gently, and whisper, "I'm still learning, Mother." And in the hush of dawn, when the wind moved through the flowers, he could almost swear the leaves whispered back, "I know." By summer, the garden had become something extraordinary. Travelers passing through the countryside often stopped to admire it, saying it felt like the place itself was alive. Some claimed they could smell roses even in winter. They didn't know the story behind it, the story of a woman who had built her peace from pain, and of those who carried her lessons after she was gone. But the ones who lived there knew, and that was enough. As the sun set over the estate, the roses caught the last light, their petals glowing like embers. June stood at the edge of the path, watching the horizon fade. Beside him, Jinho placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'd be proud," he said, "of the garden, of you, of all of us." June nodded, his voice low. "She taught us how to grow, how to love the living and let go of the gone." And as the evening air carried the scent of roses through the house, it felt as though I was still there, walking the paths barefoot, humming softly, reminding them that even after loss, life keeps blooming. Years turn quietly over the Han estate, each season painting the same familiar canvas of life and rebirth. The world beyond the gates changed, cities grew, people came and went, but within those walls, time seemed to slow, choosing instead to breathe with the rhythm of the garden. The story of the woman who once lived there became something of a legend, told in whispers and smiles by those who tended the soil she had loved. Children born to the estate's workers grew up hearing tales of me. They would run barefoot through the garden paths, laughing as they tried to find the rose bush that held my resting place. June, now older and wise beyond his years, would tell them, "She's everywhere in this garden. Every flower you touch carries her breath." And the children would giggle, brushing their fingers against the petals as if to greet an old friend. Jinho grew older too, his hair now flecked with silver. He had rebuilt his life not through wealth but through kindness. He opened a small nursery in the nearby town where he taught young people how to grow and care for plants. "My mother taught me everything I know about living things," he would say to his students. "She believed that every seed deserves patience and love, just like people." Sometimes, when customers complimented his roses, he would smile and reply, "They were my mother's favorite." He visited the estate less often as the years passed, not because he had forgotten, but because he had finally learned to live. On the rare days he returned, he would still kneel beside my grave, tracing the letters carved into the stone. "I'm still growing, Mother," he would whisper, and every time, without fail, a breeze would stir the roses, their petals brushing together like gentle applause. Mr. Han lived to a graceful old age, surrounded by laughter and warmth. Before he passed, he made one final request. that his ashes be scattered at the edge of the garden, near the pond, where we had once walked together. She made this place a home again, he had told the staff. I want to rest where her spirit still lingers. They honored his wish, and from that day on, the pond never froze, even in the coldest winters. The caretaker said it was the warmth of friendship that kept it alive. When June eventually inherited the role of head gardener, he preserved every corner of the estate with devotion. He opened the grounds to visitors, inviting anyone who sought comfort to walk among the roses. People came from distant towns, leaving small notes tied to the branches, messages of love, loss, and hope. They called it the Garden of Renewal. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of wine, the wind would pass through the estate, carrying the scent of blooming roses to the farthest corners. Those who stood quietly and listened swore they could hear a faint humming, soft, familiar, like a lullaby. And though my name was slowly lost to time, my story lived on, not in books or plaques, but in the soil, the petals, the hearts of those who had once known me. The garden remained my legacy, a testament that no pain, however deep, can silence the will to love again. Because love, like roses, will always find a way to bloom again, even after the harshest winter. Sometimes, the stories that begin in sorrow end not with a tear, but with a lesson that outlives the storyteller. The woman who once walked barefoot through the Han estate left behind no monument, no riches, no written memoir, only a garden that refused to stop blooming. And those who came after her, even generations later, spoke her name with tenderness, though they never knew her face. They said that if you walked the garden paths at dawn, when the dew still clung to the petals and the air smelled faintly of jasmine, you could hear a faint voice in the wind, a woman humming softly as if to remind the world that forgiveness is not weakness and that love, once planted, never dies. For in the quiet rhythm of blooming and wilting, of loss and return, her truth remained eternal. We are all gardeners of our own hearts. Trim the pain, tend the hope, and let love bloom again. Section 14, The Guard.